Well, let's have a look now at the move Queen d1, which arises after d4, d6, c4, e5, knight c3, ed, queen takes d4, knight c6, and now queen goes back to d1. Now, in some senses, although it looks like it's lost a lot of time, the queen is actually slightly safer on d1. It's not as subject to black's knights coming in, say, to e4 or some such thing. It also leaves the bishop on c1 free to come out, say to g5. So there are some points behind it. Now, black could play knight f6, which we've seen against queen d2, but I think a slightly better move may be g6. And one of the ideas of g6 is that we're not necessarily committed to bringing the knight to f6. We might put it on e7 instead, where it would allow us to play f5 in some situations. So after g6, our main game is a game between Lombardy and Quinteros from the Haifa Olympiad in 1976. And in this game, Lombardy, as is his wont, he took space with e4. And after bishop g7, he went bishop d3. And now Quinteros played knight g7, which is the setup I mentioned a couple of moves ago, making f5 possible without further ado. White played f4, gaining space, stopping a black knight coming into e5. And after castles knight f3, black got counterplay by going knight d4. Now, here we actually see another point behind putting this knight on e7. Sometimes we might want to bring it to c6 after playing knight d4 in order to occupy the d4 square. So there are a couple of points behind it. Well, Lombardy didn't want to exchange this knight off. Instead, he played knight d2. And if he did something like castles, for example, then he'd have to reckon with bishop g4, which is really quite an annoying move to have to meet. So he went knight d2, but then black got counterplay by going c6, and when white castled, he played d5, opening the centre. The game went on cd, cd, e5, and now black went bishop f5, bishop takes f5, knight d takes f5, getting a position in which his isolated d-pawn is also a passed pawn, and he has the opportunity to free his bishop on g7 by going f6 and undermine this pawn on e5. So I think black's got a very nice, comfortable position out of that. Now, instead of playing knight g7, it is also possible to play knight f6, and the idea being that the knight can be well placed on the c5 square, and we've seen this manoeuvre knight d7 to c5 a couple of times. A possible line would go knight g2 and then black castling, and let's say white castling, and then black going maybe bishop e6. You could do knight d7 straight away, and after f3, knight d7, bishop e3. I think knight c5 would produce a position that's about equal. Black can play f5, and maybe he's going to take white's bishop on d3 sometime soon. Now, as with queen d2, white can also adopt a fianchetto here. He can go g3, and this was actually played in a game which finished in 13 moves. I'll show you that game because it's very surprising. It's a game Dimitriadi against Zahariev from the Hania Open in 1995. And after g3, black went bishop g7, white played bishop g2, and then black kept open the diagonal for his bishop by playing this development we've mentioned before, knight g e7. White played e3, which is kind of a funny looking move. But one of the problems for white is that it's not easy for him now to defend the c4 pawn, because b3 is going to leave the knight on c3 hanging. So there are some problems for white when black doesn't block in his bishop on g7 by going knight f6. Okay, e3, black castled. White played knight g2, and black went bishop e6. White played knight d5, and black played knight e5, attacking the pawn on c4. And if b3, then the rook would be lost to some discovered check by the knight, say knight f3 check. So after knight e5, white decided he was going to take off the knight on e7. Black recaptured, and he thought, well, in for a penny, in for a pound, I'm going to take the pawn on b7. But then he got shocked by the move c6, hitting his bishop. Queen's attacking the bishop. And the problem is that if he takes the rook, then black, as he did in the game, plays knight f3 check. And surprisingly, it's mate in 2. White has to go king f1, and then bishop h3 is mate. So that was Dimitriadi meeting his doom against Zahariev. Now, again, as with the move queen d2, white can try b3 on move 6, and then black would go bishop g7, bishop b2, and now knight f6. I think is probably a very reasonable way to go. And in one game, again between Heisenbüttel and Reicher from the World Seniors in 1993, one game that white played g3, black castled, he went bishop g2, and now black demonstrated another way of getting counterplay. He went bishop d7, and white went queen d2, and then he went a6. White played knight h3, getting ready to come to f4 and just castle, and black played rook b8, so that after castles b5, white had to take the pawn off on b5, and black recaptured and got quite a promising position, I think. You know, there's some chances of going b4, and it's not really clear that this knight on h3 is incredibly well placed. Now, finally, one idea behind queen d1 is to keep open the diagonal for this bishop. So to queen d1, g6, knight f3, knight f6, do bishop g7, and white would still do the same thing. White can play bishop g5 here, which is a kind of simple plan. h6, bishop h4, bishop g7 is a reasonable way for black to go against it. And now e3. So white's got a fairly compact position with the pawn on e3 and the bishop outside the pawn chain. Yeah, it's a sensible plan. I don't think it actually gives white any advantage whatsoever. And a game between Horvath, Julia Horvath, because there's quite a few Horvaths around, and Dobrovsky from the Tankers Cup in Harkany in 1995. After e3, black just castled, and then white played bishop e2, black played bishop f5, white castled, and then black played g5, and after bishop g3, he went knight h5. And this gives black a comfortable game. He's got two bishops. The slight weakness to his king side doesn't really matter. And black was really very okay. He He can also play g5 actually on the ninth move. You can do it in this position. G5, bishop g3, knight h5, I think would be very playable here as well. Although there is a case for waiting until white castles kingside before doing this, so you won't get any possible profit from the opening of the h file. So, well, that brings the coverage of queen takes d4 to its conclusion. In the next section, we will be looking at the move 3 d5.